So a friend of mine gave me this 42-inch television here behind me, and I don't really need it. It doesn't work. It's got 4 HDMI ports, and none of them work. The Ethernet port works, so you can connect to Netflix and watch stuff, just stream stuff on TV, but I don't really need to do that because I've got another television right here behind the camera. So I think the plan is just to tear it down. What I do need is a light for my kid's room, and I'm going to take this television apart and turn it into a daylight, kind of like a skylight for the kids' room. So let's get started. Yeah. So the first step in this process is to remove all the screws from the back panel. There are quite a few screws in this particular television. Just make sure you get all of them. There, got them all. That was a lot of screws. Okay, so let's get this lid off. First step in this process is to remove all the screws from the back panel. There are quite a few screws in this particular television. Just make sure you get all. Once the power board is removed, you can disconnect all the wires from the other board, forgot the name of it, and any other auxiliary boards that are there. Just set all the wires aside. This particular chip is the reason why this board stopped working. It powers all 4 HDMI ports, and the television works, but that chip is bad. This is the Wi-Fi module, and I may end up reusing that in another project. Alright, next I am removing the brackets off the back of the television. The wires that plug into that board that has a protector on it, the Phillips screws on that protector are too small, so I'm going to have to remove those by hand. At this point I'm removing all the wires. Those are the high voltage wires, that one that I just threw off the side there. That's the high voltage wire that powers the compact flash bulbs that are in this television. Next I'm removing the speakers. I'm setting those aside. I'll probably use those for some other project as well. Just trying to remove all the tape that's on the back of this television that was holding all the wires down. There are some brackets that are holding the metal backing frame onto the plastic frame. And this is the infrared receiver. I'll probably end up using that on another project too. I'll probably end up doing a video on reusing some of these components as well. That board is attached to the power buttons on the side of the television. So that pops out. That's the infrared receiver for picking up signals from the remote. That I will have to use a small screwdriver to unscrew that protective cover for the driver board for the LCD screen. And there's the driver board. So move that loose, get it loose, lay it over so I can lift the entire TV box out. And this had a lot more screws that were holding the brackets in on the front of the screen. So remove all of those and lift the brackets out. At this point, with those removed, I am able to lift up on the LCD panel and lift it free. So the driver board is connected to the LCD, and then as I drop this, you will see the LCD panel separate. There we go. So the frame now has the light diffusion layers. That is the LCD panel. I'm going to set that off to the side and figure out what to do with that. These are all the light diffusion layers here. And the compact fluorescent bulbs are behind those diffusion layers. They are plastic. There are 3 sheets on this particular television. There are 2 thin ones that are closest to the LCD panel, and there is a thick one that's maybe about a 1/16 inch thick that is closest to the LCD screen. This has a plastic frame around it with a bunch of clips all the way around. I think on the long side there are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, about 12 clips on each of the long sides, and I believe about 8 on the short side. So once those are all popped loose, the light diffusion layers, those plastic sheets, will be able to be lifted free. There we go. You can see through them, sort of. These layers on these older televisions are not as good. The diffusion is not as good as some of the newer televisions. So if you have a newer TV, then you will end up with a much nicer diffusion sheets. So I'm setting those 2 off to the side, and then there is the thick plastic sheet there. I'll set that one off to the side as well. And you can see in that frame all those compact fluorescent bulbs. Dispose of these properly. They do have mercury in them, so just removing the end plates that hold it down, and there are some screws that hold those circuit boards on either end. Also that white paper backing layer, which is what I'm going for now. All those, there's a bunch of little plastic keepers. All those little white ones there, you got to pop all those loose so that it will release the compact fluorescent bulbs. My little helper came in to say hi. So with those popped loose, we can set the main metal frame out of the way and lift off the reflective white backing layer. That leaves this array of compact fluorescent bulbs. So set them off to the side. Next, go ahead and mark out the spacing for your new LED strips. I bought 2 rolls of 16 feet of 6,000 Kelvin temperature LED strips, and at this point I am just marking where the compact fluorescent bulbs, because they were laid out in that distance apart. So at this point I'm just marking it out so I can lay the LED panels, I mean the LED strips, all out evenly. So you can cut them into strips here, if you look, you can notice that there is a positive and a negative here and here. So when you cut on that line and you solder them back together, make sure that you solder the positive to the positive and the negative to the negative. These have adhesive on the back, so I strip the adhesive off and go ahead and stick the LED strips all down on the lines that I just marked out. I didn't have enough. I bought 32 feet worth of LED strip, and doing it this way with these older televisions, there's only enough for that number of lines. So there are 4 lines that I marked out that I do not have LED strips on, but there's plenty of light that this gives off. So with all of these strips in place, I am now going to solder each strip together. So you'll get your roll of solder, and just put a little dab on each of the exposed copper circles here, one for positive, one for negative. And then you'll solder. I used black and red wire. Black is negative, red is positive, and I soldered the ends of these wires onto each of the solder blobs on the ends of each of these strips. This basically takes and makes it so that the entire strip will light up. Since I cut them all to fit them on the board, you need to reattach the positive to the positive, the negative to the negative for each of the strips that you cut up and tape down to this paper. These wires are so short, it probably would have been easier if I had used a pair of pliers to hold them in place. But I got this to work eventually. At this point, I am adding a little bit additional solder to the wire to make it solder a little bit easier. Repeating the process with the black wire. So you'll notice we solder it together in one continuous strip. You don't solder both ends together. So this end is solder these two together, and then the other end we solder the joints that are not connected. You'll notice that gap right in the center there. That is the LEDs on the left hand side are one strip, one 16-foot strip, and the ones on the right hand are another 16-foot strip. And you do not want to join those two together. There are 2 power plugs, and you basically want to keep one 16-foot length together and the other 16-foot length together. Here you can see the positive and the negative, and you want to make sure that you get them soldered together correctly. Positive to positive, negative to negative when you solder them. You'll notice on the left there, there are 2 power plugs, or 2 strips. And it works. Alright guys, time for a quick intermission here. At this point in the project, where you see it here on the editor, the original plan was to go ahead and build a wooden frame around that plastic frame and figure out some way to make it look nice. I had put the paper that I attached the LEDs to back inside this case and put the diffusion layers back on, and that frame was just super heavy. I wasn't happy with it. I didn't want to mount it up in my kids' room, and we live in an earthquake territory, so I was worried about it maybe coming off the wall. And the backing plate, as you saw earlier in the vid film, was uneven, so I scrapped that idea. I decided to build the frame and get rid of the steel backing plate here altogether, the plastic frame, and just make it all work with a wooden frame. So from here on out, this is making the frame and putting the diffusion layers and the backing light and everything all together to make it work with that. So, carry. Alright, so now at this point I am in the process of making the frame. I am cutting out 4 pieces to make a square frame, and I found the easiest way. My plan was to cut out half of to notch the board to set the diffusion layers in to encapsulate the light. So the easiest way to do that is to mark halfway the distance on the board and then cut measure the length of the final length that I need it in the center of the board there. You can either do the math and mark the outside edge of the board, but I'm cutting it at a 45-degree angle, and since I know I'm cutting half of that board away, it's just easier to cut the length and mark it in the center of the board there. There's the first piece. I cut out another 3 and then set up the table saw and cut notches in all of the boards here. I didn't show the table saw part because this is an old table saw, and I used procedures that aren't terribly safe, which I am comfortable using, but I didn't really want to show it on screen. So there are the final pieces with the notch cut in them. They're all an L-shaped, and at this point I am going to glue all the corners, spread the glue around, and then clamp them together with that clamp that is on the center of the table there. So I put a little bit extra glue on the 2 pieces so I can smear it on with my finger and then use that glue on the other 2 pieces. Makes it a little bit faster and more efficient. I didn't use any nails assembling this frame. I glued it, and then you'll see a little bit later I used dowels, glued some dowels into the end to help hold it in place. Now that the glue is applied, stand all the pieces up, square them up, square up the corners, and then put the clamp on. This is a strap clamp I got it at a local big box home improvement store. Basically, those little plastic pieces sit on the corner and apply pressure, and then you tighten the strap down and it keeps it all locked in place while the glue dries. They're really handy. Go ahead and crank that down. That'll cinch the corners all together. Take the square and make sure the frame is still square, and then adjust the corner pieces to make sure that the cuts align. If they don't, you can grab that plastic piece and tweak it one way or the other, and it will shift the end of the board so it will line up perfectly. Now it's time to let this frame dry. So in the meantime, I'm going to take the thin diffusion layers, there's 2 of them. I'm going to cut all those tabs off while I'm waiting for the frame to dry. That way the diffusion light panels will fit inside the frame I just made perfectly. I tried cutting 2 of them at once initially, but it didn't really work that well, so I decided to do one at a time. Now the frame is mostly dry, and I'm coming back and drilling in the ends, and I'm going to glue dowels in and then cut the ends of the dowels off to reinforce the frame and help it stay together a little bit more easily. I realize that where I'm drilling is not the thickest part of the board facing me, but it should be enough to help hold it, give it a little bit more surface area for the glue to grab and hold it together. So I drilled opposing sides, I did the same on the other end, and then I came back and did the other side of the corner as well. So there are 2 dowels on each corner at perpendicular angles to each other. To get this to work, to hold, I just squirt some glue on, smear it, jam it in the hole, and then just cut off. That's a 16th inch dowel. So once I have it glued in place, I just use a pair of wire snips and cut it off pretty close. So at this point I have dowels, one dowel inserted on each corner, and the frame is dry enough now that I am just removing the strap and putting the second dowel in. You can see it sits a little bit lower on the frame, and it just drills straight in, and then I'll put 4 more dowel pieces in on each of the corners, or 1 more piece on each of the corners. With that done, it's time to let the frame dry, and I have some of this 1/8 inch corrugated plastic. It's basically plastic cardboard that I am using as the rear cover of this light. That paper panel that I glued or that I attached the LED strips to is going to be glued to this panel. I thought I had recorded that bit. Basically just used hot glue and glued that strip with the LEDs on it to this piece that I'm cutting out right now. But my camera battery died, so I didn't get any of the gluing operation. So the next time you see that, it will be attached to this piece that I'm cutting out right now. I'm reusing a piece of the television as a straight edge right now. I do have a T-square that's big enough, but this scrap piece was handy, so I decided to make use of it. Just using a box cutter to cut this out. If you use this same method, then you want to make this layer that I'm cutting out the same size as the light diffusion panels, unless you do some sort of different design. with this cut out, it's time to test fit it into the frame. See how it fits. Nice and snug. So now it's time to finish the frame. So there's a lot of sanding here. Broke it down into small bits here, and you want to knock off the sharp edges. You want to get rid of any splinters. I'm using red oak here. Next I took a file and I ground down the dowel pins flush, and I did it carefully so I didn't mar the surface of the frame. I'm going to come back with the sandpaper and I'm going to sand those dowels flush with the edge of the frame. So just going around, taking them all down. There's just a slight bit sticking over the edge there, you can see. Now it's time for the final round of sanding. This is going around and sanding all the pins down, sanding the corners off, the sharp corners, the sharp edges, making sure all the splinters are completely gone. I started this with just a piece of sandpaper in the hand, but that sandpaper heated up pretty good as I scrubbed, and so I dug out my sanding block and used it instead. Just checking all the corners, making sure didn't miss anything. Then it's time to get a towel and wipe off all the sawdust so we can apply the Danish oil. Now I'm just using Watco Danish oil here. It was just a can of oil that was available at my local big box store, and so that's what I went with. You can use whatever brand or color you want. You can stain it. This is just to protect it. Hope the wood lasts a little longer. You'll notice as I rub it in that the grain really pops out. Gives it a nice finish. I didn't show applying both coats. I did apply 2 coats to this. I put one on, let it dry for 15 or 20 minutes, and then applied a second coat. Really makes that grain stand out. Repeated this all the way around. Just finishing up here. This is the last leg. You'll notice that those dowels blend in really well. They're hard to see. I also flipped it over and applied some to the inside as well. So at this point I'm making use of these glazing points. I'm going to press them into the wood, and they are going to act as a backstop for the corrugated plastic that I'm using as the backing sheet to hold the light. I'm making 3 marks, one in the center, one at 1/4 of the way across, and one at 3/4 of the way across. That's what one of those glazing points look like. You can grab it in the pliers like this, and then take that sharp point, wiggle it back and forth, and force it down into the wood. I am not convinced this is the best method, but it seems to work okay. Doing it again, there's probably a better way to do it. I'd probably put a slightly deeper frame on it and then use wood backstop to hold it in place. It would look a little bit nicer when it's finished. So that's what the glazing point looks like when it's pushed into the wood. It's set a 1/16 of an inch down. So at this point, I'm putting the diffusion layers from the TV into the frame. Those are the two thin layers. Those are going first, and then the thick plastic sheet will go on behind that. The reason I did it that way is because that is the order that they were placed in the television. So my assumption is that there's something about that order that helps diffuse the light a little bit better. So for this end, with those glazing points in, I had to pry it just a little bit to get that panel to slip past the glazing point. Now, at this point is where I cleaned off that corrugated plastic, and I glued the paper strip there to the back of it, and that's where my battery ran out. Thankfully I realized it before I went too far. So at this point I just used hot glue and I just glued that paper down. I put basically one strip of glue behind each LED strip. I lined it up and then I applied glue on one side, and I lifted up and run a strip across, and then press down until the glue dried, and then do another strip. So right now I'm just trimming the excess off because that is a little bit long for the frame that I made. Then I'm going to flip this over and place it in the frame and use the paper that's hanging down on each side to kind of help reflect the light out. Right now I test fit it in, and the power cable is on the far end. So I test fit this in there, and then I set the power cable out the end. I was trying to decide how to make it so I could plug it in, and then it dawned on me that it was long enough to reach the edge there, and that I could just drill a hole right through the wood and fix that plug directly into the wood. So I think this is a 1/2 inch drill bit because the size of the plug was that big. I drill a hole into the frame and then clean all the sawdust out, all the wood dust from the drill bit, and glue that power plug in place. I'll show it close up here in a minute. So remove the cover, get rid of all the dust, put the cover back in place. I mean the light panel back in place, so that I can glue. I just use hot glue. Glued it around the power plug, jam the power plug into the hole that I just drilled, let it set up and dry. Put extra on the inside to help hold it. And that's what the power plug looks like on the end. Got extra glue on the inside. Straighten that plug up a little bit. And then just held it there while the glue set up. Now that it's set up, I adjust and reset the back panel. Take care to make sure that the paper, the backing paper for the LED strips, is set up into the corner. Line up that plastic panel just right. Make sure it sits on top of those glazing strips that I pushed in. And then just line up the back and pop it in. It's a little bit of a snug fit, not quite snug enough. So I wanted to make sure it stayed put, so I went ahead and applied some hot glue. I think I will probably figure out a better way to do it, but the hot glue holds it in place for now. I thought about using a piece of thin masonite as the backing layer, and then just nailing it to the frame, and I may still do that. let's just squirt glue in where the glazing points are, press down, let it set up, and then this is the finished panel. All right, guys, that's it for this one. Go ahead and leave any comments or questions you have below. If you'd like to keep up to date with my next projects, go ahead and like and subscribe. I will see you on the next one.